Welcome to the Thoughtful Software Podcast. My name is Fahad Shoukat, and joining me is Andrew Wolfe, CEO of SkipList. This podcast is all about building incredible and thoughtful software. So in this episode, we speak with Ed Olson-Morgan, who is the head of Bain & Company's development lab in the Americas. Ed has worked in consulting and technology for the last 13 years, and we discussed innovation at large enterprises. This is an important topic as we believe continuous innovation is a critical strategy every organization must implement. And we discussed areas around how to build an innovation team, some common mistakes enterprises make, interesting upcoming trends, and many other topics. Whether you are thinking about innovation or not, we encourage you to listen to this episode with Ed. We hope you'll find it informative. Here's Ed kicking things off by discussing what is innovation. So here we go.
I tend to be someone who thinks about it as there's a pretty broad spectrum of things that I consider being innovation. I don't think it has to be the complete industry disruptor. So I think even the first step towards developing a new digital application, whether it's internal or external facing, whether it's changing the way that you interact with a customer, even frankly something that's process or human based rather than being digital based, is still an innovation. I think it's the art of trying to do something different. And measuring that and understanding what's going on and making sure that it's working to actually drive the business value or the impact that you were looking to do when you decided to innovate.
I think all of us can agree that innovation is very critical. How do you foster innovation or like entrepreneurialism at these large corporations? I've found that to be very challenging.
I agree. And I think part of the challenge is at a lot of large corporations, one of the real benefits for, if you think from their employees, and I think of innovation very much as a human problem. It's something where people have to decide to take a risk and step outside of what they would normally do day to day. But within a large organization, there's normally a very clear way to progress or advance. A clear way to grow your career. It's often doing the things well that the organization has done well to get to where it is today. And so in order to innovate, you have to give people that space to take risks, to take potentially time away from a day job, to take potentially step away from that job altogether and focus on doing something that's in the classic standards of that organization might not work. I mean, that's one of the great things and the great challenges about innovation is that it is incredibly rare to do something innovative that you don't learn from or that you don't develop new capabilities while you do it. But it's very common to do something that the first time you do it doesn't get you the results you wanted. And so that's setting up a permission for people to do that and try and fail is really important.
I find that really interesting because I like to think of innovation the same way you do. And just like good architecture, it's built over time. And I think people try to do this big bang innovation, this disruptive innovation, like 0 to 100. And I think what you need is a lot of small innovations, like good ideas, right? No one starts with a grand idea. They're built on each other. And, you can make customer service better. You can make accounting slightly better, sales slightly better, marketing slightly better, and combine those small innovations with small growth points, be something bigger. And people start noticing and they get ideas. And you have to allow people to be those change agents that are really passionate about, hey, I really like sales process. Let that person make those small tweaks and encourage people to be empowered, to be able to notice those improvements and actually take action. Because I see a lot of people notice them at big companies, but not a lot of people take action or empowered to take action on them.
Do you think you should have a separate innovation group? Like when you talk about empowering individuals, I think the challenge is that, innovation is not inherently part of their job description or it's a separate team. Like how do you work around that?
So I think that's been one of sort of the really interesting questions over the last several years. And there are pretty strong opinions on both sides of the fence from people who are smart and I respect. Personally, I think innovation is so much more powerful when it comes from people who are within an individual line of business, who are part of an organization rather than something that feels new or separate or bolted on. And I think what that tends to mean is that innovation that comes from those sort of groups may be less radical at first, but it's much more likely to stick and succeed. I remember sort of going back several years, working with an organization, and one of the things that they did is they started off with an innovation group, and their innovation group came up with a ton of ideas. And then their innovation group actually had to justify to sort of the core leadership, basically get the core leadership of the businesses they wanted to change on side, and did so actually to the point that, they've actually switched leaders. And they said, hey, guy who's running the innovation group, move across and run a regular line of business for a while. Guy who's running the regular line of business, switch across and run the innovation group. And keeping things tied together like that, I think it's better culturally for an organization. It sort of starts to build more of that, architectural capability that Andrew talks about.
Let's touch on the process of innovation. So what's a good starting point? Where should, I think we all talked about like an incremental change or incremental innovation.
So at least to my mind, a good starting point is picking something of a business metric, a value, something you want to move the needle on. Ideally, something that's got some sort of financial benefit associated with it, or it could be a problem within an organization, maybe in the way that something is done. That's just a real pain point for everybody. So you've got there's going to be a clear benefit to what you do. I think the other thing that's really important then is figuring out something that you can take action on early, right? If your best innovative idea is going to need 2 years of infrastructure and architecture and data science capability building to bring to fruition, that's not going to work as well with an organization as something as maybe where you can make change in 6, 12, 18 weeks. And so, starting with an idea that you can go after that drives business value, and then going through an innovation process that's very designed around generating excitement and output. Think about, it could be design sprints or something else along those lines. But the idea of being able to produce wireframes and prototypes and visuals that people can get their heads around if it's a digital product, or changes to a business process and what's needed to do that if it's not, to get people excited and saying, hey, things are moving, and then sort of going from there.
So what are your thoughts on like an innovation roadmap? I see a lot of people doing these days where they know they want to make this big bang change to like maybe their manufacturing process, or they want to add software to one of their big business lines. And so what they do is they say, we're going to do a small change in the next 2 months, slightly bigger change in the next 4 months. And then 2 years down the road, they've made a bunch of small tweaks, but they've added up to this big monster thing that they've done to a pretty major part of their business. And they seem to be effective. I've seen a few of them work. I've seen one of them fail, but it may not have been the roadmap's fault on that one. But what are your thoughts? Do you see that being a common tool people use, or do you have other tools you like to use?
I think that's a great tool. I think the only sort of caveat that I'd add is, for a tool like that, you want to make sure that you're learning as you go through the whole process. And so the roadmap doesn't become so much something you're held to as something that shows, at this point in time, this is our best view of the vision forward. And I don't know the specific example you talked about, but I wonder if that might have had something to do with the one that failed. Is that sometimes, if you laid out an innovation roadmap early on, you're making your guess at a point where you know less about what you're trying to solve, then you'll know at every other point after that. And so taking ideas from the way that we like to build software, but constantly learning and iterating and changing the backlog and the roadmap as you go forward, that allows you to sort of have that long-term vision, but at the same time tie it back to what you know from the real world.
Yeah, it was rigidity that was the problem in the process. They saw errors, issues that came up, and there was always going to be issues no matter what you do. And they didn't deviate or even pivot slightly from the roadmap. They made some changes, and they were obviously, the small changes they made were beneficial. So it wasn't complete waste, but they didn't get to their end result because I don't know if their end result was ever achievable. And they needed to change their target and their trajectory to get there to something that was feasible as soon as they realized it wasn't. And I think there's people tell you that when things are hard, you shouldn't give up. But I think there's also truth in the fact that pivoting isn't giving up, it's letting go, and being able to, recognize when things are just literally impossible, and not just, we can't achieve this, but just, this can't be done at the exact moment they were trying to do it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things where, across the top of your innovation roadmap, you should have why are you doing something. So, as a project that I did in the last couple of years was all around reducing waste in the supply chain. And the goal at every point was, our waste number is 10%. We want it below 6%. And that was the goal that never changed. The things that were on the roadmap, the order in which things were going to be rolled out, how things were going to be tested, everything else, those changed pretty frequently as we learned more and as we went through the process. But that overall goal, we kept pushing towards that and hit it. So I think that's, you may find that there may be cases where you find the business goal isn't achievable either, and getting most of the way there generally is pretty positive and yields benefits to the company. But not being willing to deviate from the way you get to that goal can often be at that point you've decided that you only innovate once rather than constantly continuing to innovate.
Yep. And I think too, you miss the opportunity if you're so focused on the things and not the actual metric, that there are other metrics you're improving along the way, but there's also potential innovations off the beaten path that you might include that might provide benefits in other areas that are low, effort, but high value activities that you should always keep your eye on, because, you might make a tweak over in one area, your line of business, and then find out that if you tweak this over in accounting or whatever, that you get 10% more efficient in that area. And that's just worth it to do because it's going to take you a week to implement.
Yeah. So those beneficial side effects of the action, as you're learning and as you're discovering during innovation, you suddenly find things that you didn't expect, and you can apply to either other areas of the business or just naturally emerge as you're going through the process of discovery.
Yeah, I think one powerful point that you guys touched on was the vision and roadmap. I think that's probably the central, most important thing about innovation. Like if a couple of years ago, I was talking to an appliance manufacturer, right? And they wanted to innovate their products, which is something that is very needed. But it's like, okay, how do you actually make the kitchen smarter? What is it you're trying to do? Is it just making these appliances communicate with each other? Or is it just making sure that, food is on the table or grocery list is built? What is the overall vision? And then building in the right technology like computer vision or AI to help enable that one vision that they're after. And I think that's one thing, the first thing enterprises should define.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great example. But again, your business metrics there, you can think around things like, are you trying to reduce the amount of time that people take to do average household tasks? Are you trying to reduce, the amount of food waste in a refrigerator? And once you set your goal around those things, then it's becomes much easier to move things forward and figure out, okay, is the technology really giving me the innovation that my customers want, which is then the bit that they're going to buy and grow your business with.
Yeah, I actually think when we don't look at metrics, I think if you look at some of the smart devices, you look at them and their interfaces are so bad that you almost go to think, well, I think your actual intent is to collect data on me so you know what I'm actually doing in my kitchen or doing with my furnace. And if you don't start with what you're trying to accomplish, I think you end up with just data collection devices, which if you don't know how people are using the refrigerator, maybe that's a good goal, but you should be upfront with your users and say, hey, this isn't a massive innovation by putting a tablet on here. We're definitely trying to make sure that you're being future-proofed, and we're going to collect data and innovate over time using software. So we put some cameras in here that we don't necessarily using right now, and we have added benefit that we can update with. I think it's a good selling point, and without that business metric, it's very hard to figure out what you're after.
Should innovation be a continuous task at an enterprise, or should it be? I'm just saying, should it be embedded in the fabric of the company, at all times, no matter how the economy is going?
I think it has to be. You might change the focus of what you're doing with innovation depending on where you are in the economic cycle. When things are doing well, that's maybe the time to swing for the fences a little bit more, or potentially try and innovate outside of some of your core business areas. When maybe if the economy is tighter and your growth metrics and everything else aren't necessarily where you want them to be, that's the point where you should be thinking about innovation for operational efficiencies, innovation to drive sort of more incremental sales. But I can't think really of an example of many industries at this point where the companies that are leading them throughout different phases of the business cycle aren't also pushing on innovating. I mean, even you take somebody, even somebody like Amazon, who we think of as the perennial innovator and constantly rolling out new services. I think Jeff Bezos was quoted fairly recently as saying, as he at one day expects Amazon to be overtaken and replaced. At some point, he's like, there is a pretty decent chance that somebody else will get better and out innovate us at what we're doing, and so they feel that need and pressure to constantly keep moving and getting better at serving their customers.
And to add to that, I think it's been part of manufacturing process, Kaizen techniques like that, to continually innovate. And some manufacturing companies, ironically, use Kaizen and have a really efficient, they use black belts to make their manufacturing process great, but they don't do the same thing on their product side, which I always found interesting. But if you're like those kind of practices, they work. I mean, if you look at people that implement Kaizen and you look at the numbers of people that don't, it's clearly obviously a beneficial practice to review how you're building things and finding inefficiencies and finding what you're good at, and always being retrospective about it helps companies.
I mean, you also have like a lot of, so technology is pretty widespread. You have all these services like AWS, so you can actually build applications and innovate very quickly. So like it's, if you don't innovate, like Amazon's use case, like as you mentioned, Ed, you'll get out innovated very, very quickly. Like the rapid change is so fast now. Like 20 years ago, you could kind of have maybe a 12-month, 18-month cycle, but it's no longer like that anymore.
So I actually had a thought about this. I don't know how true it is, and I haven't done my research because I've been busy building skip list. But the question I have is, has innovation accelerated? And I think that's definitely true. But how much is it innovation accelerating versus the tolerance to release products earlier? And what I mean by that is, if you look at the time GE spent from inception to delivery for products in their heyday versus Amazon, there's got to be some part of that is Amazon's more willing to release an incomplete product than GE was. And how much is that versus how much of it is innovation enabled through things like cloud and AI and all of that, and I don't know what that breakdown is, but it'd be very interesting to do a study on that and see exactly where that lies.
Yeah, I think that would be fascinating. You'd need to define some sort of metric. I don't know, feature completeness or something at release. But I think it has to be a mixture of both. And the reason is that even if I go back, 10 years, the time taken to provision a server was, 4 months. And much of that was literally sourcing the physical hardware that you needed from different points around the world, and getting if there was a flood in Thailand, your hard drives would be delayed, and getting all of that together. And so there was a natural limitation. I was working in analytics at the time. A natural limitation to how fast you could try something that was big and new and computationally nasty. And I can now go and get that hardware from AWS or any cloud provider in less than the time it will take for us to have this discussion, have it fully provisioned up there and running for me. And so there's definitely some overhead time for trying new things that has gone away. But I also agree, if you look at even if we go apples to apples and look at software, look at Microsoft's release cycles for the sort of 2-year release cycles for Office in its heyday, and there were not that was not a product that was being released when it wasn't ready to be released. Whereas I think now you're seeing many more incremental updates, over the air, adding new features, not weekly, but at least every month or so.
Yeah,
and probably the expansion of like open source, like GitHub and all these other services out there, so you can pull code that's already been done. There's TensorFlow, things like that enable you to like really pull up a system very, very quickly.
I also think crossing the chasm, they talk about segments of the market, and I think there are a lot more early adopters these days. People want to be the first to have the new quote iPhone, the new cool device, and people are more willing to accept flaws in products and say, well, I had Google Glass first, if that was a success, or products like that. And they're willing to go out and find not half-baked, but certainly not as complete products as before, just to be there first. I think social media helps with that, right? If you can be the first one to post a picture with your new cool device, That's social cred to you. I don't know if that social cred used to exist, or maybe it wasn't as public as it is now.
Yeah, and I think even I think it's much easier for people to use social media and share things that they're excited about. So there are certain products and apps that I've tried and used, and social media makes it easier for me to let a couple of thousand people. I'm not an influencer by any means, but a couple of thousand people that are in my various networks. If I really want to talk about something, I can do that relatively easy in a way that again 10 years ago would have been a lot of phone calls and emails. So.
Absolutely. And you have people that are social media influencers getting products early from Google, Microsoft, Amazon, or other Kickstarters and putting them in their videos, and millions of people are watching these videos. So it kind of influences, oh, they got that, I need to get that too. Very powerful influences on people's psyches and how people consume.
What's the downside of that? Like, I see that there's just a lot of bad stuff out there too. Bad products, bad software. What's the downside of, I guess Facebook made this famous, or Mark Zuckerberg, like, I think he said, what is it? Build fast, break fast, something like that. What was it?
Move fast and break things.
Yeah. But, you see a lot of bad stuff out there.
I think that's part of it. I don't think people intend to do it, but part of it too is, and this comes down to discipline for a company. Is being incredibly disciplined in what you release and what your quality metrics are willing to tell you about the things you're releasing. And if you're just doing a Kickstarter, you don't have the discipline. But nowadays, I can call up a Chinese manufacturer because we have very lax global standards, or we did at one point. Let's see if that trend continues. But I'm able to call a Chinese manufacturer, do a Kickstarter, get $1.5 million, build a product, and I don't have the quality standards. I'm a 5-man shop at best, sometimes 3. We're worried about getting a product shipped, and under a tight deadline of, I have 9 months to ship a product that probably takes an enterprise 1.5 to 2 years to build. Of course, you're going to have quality issues, and you're going to require a lot more releases, a lot more patch notes, because things are rushed.
What are some of the biggest opportunities you see for enterprises?
So I think the biggest one that I see, and I think this is probably biased by sort of what some of my experiences have been over the years, is for enterprises to innovate internally at the same speed they're trying to innovate externally. And so, for very good reasons, sort of over the last 10, 20 years, businesses are becoming more and more customer focused. I think if you go back to sort of the big organization days of maybe GE in their heyday, a lot of the focus was on how do we run ourselves really efficiently. We focus internally on the organization. Then I think people missed some tricks around where the market was heading. And so everybody said, we've got to be externally facing, and all the resource and everything goes on to driving the best possible customer outcomes. And I think, especially with some of the stuff that both of you guys just mentioned, be it clouds, be it the availability of open source software, there's now the ability to do both and say, are we giving our employees and our teams the same caliber of tools and equipment and products to do their jobs as we're trying to give our customers? There's nothing more depressing than hearing about a company that's building virtual reality and AR apps for their customers to interact with the product, while at the same time you look internally and the people who are trying their best to give great customer service for those customers are working on hodgepodges of Excel and 1980s green screens and 2000s ERPs. And so I think there's this enormous internal opportunity for companies to apply that customer thinking, that design-centric thinking, that product-centric thinking to the tools their employees use, which makes them a better market for talent. And then, one of the biggest results about that is it gives you, better customer service.
I actually find, and I don't, granted, I think you have a bigger purview than me, that IT has become this, not an enemy per se, but I'll use that word, of the people at companies who are like, oh, I have to talk to IT again. It's kind of like legal. They're like, oh, I have to talk to legal again. And it's become a pain point. And I see a lot of people trying to innovate around this, where they're trying to make it inward facing, where people want to talk to IT. Have you seen this a lot? And if you have, what are some companies trying to do to combat that mindset?
I definitely have. I think it's so funny you drew the legal example. one of the things that I find is a big competitive advantage is making sure you're friendly with the attorneys anywhere you work, because as an attorney, that's going to be pretty demoralizing after a while if people don't want to talk to you. That they're and I find the same thing with attorneys. I find with IT department, they're just trying to. They're generally, everybody's trying to get the same objective. I think just the IT department has a better understanding of many cases of what the risks and the challenges are of getting there. And so I think there's been a lot of movement recently, I think, from IT departments trying to become more flexible. I think they're trying to figure out, okay, what can we make self-service? So, so you can basically, for those sort of people who would historically have done workarounds, you can say, okay, here's a whole bunch of tools and things that you can use to do the things that you want to do, and then we'll focus on the things that you can't do. We've seen that. I think the embracing of open source, again, helps a lot. And I think the final thing is really making sure that you're being very careful as an organization, whether that's technology or business, around build and buy decisions. Like you're always only going to have so much finite development resource, so much finite technology resource. And so understanding, like, let's buy things that do the job, that work where you can, and focus your build resource on the things that are genuinely different about your organization or are genuinely going to drive differentiation against your competitors. That's a pretty key lever too.
Yeah, you see a lot of SaaS coming into play here to help people be able to own their own systems. I hear that a lot. Bring your own device is another trend I see. Really taking storm, but things like Salesforce really help IT, because it's like, hey, we'll handle system customization, but you get to own the system, as it were, the process and all that, instead of having to be very, very centric. And then tools like Tableau, I see as well on my side, where it's not like having to email the Oracle experts for a report that you get 3 weeks later. You can get that Tableau desktop, procure it yourself, sit down and start visualizing and understanding your data. Those are some of the trends I've seen, but I still, there's some organizations that really dislike their IT team. It's always good to hear some techniques they can use to improve it.
Yeah, I sort of, as someone who sort of has fluctuated from being feeling like they're on the business side of an organization to feeling they're on the technology side of the organization, and you sort of, it's something you feel. It's almost become cultural. Sort of talking to IT has become like going to the dentist, and I don't think that's beneficial for anybody's organization. And I think organizations where that is a productive relationship are generally, again, I have no data or facts on this, but I would expect to ones that are generally doing better on a bunch of other unrelated metrics.
So if you're an enterprise that is thinking about innovation or enabling more like a technology, what are some of the common mistakes do you see that some of these organizations have made?
So I think there's a couple. I think one is going technology first. So saying we're going to innovate, so we're going to adopt all of these new technologies, and then we're going to figure out what the use case is, rather than being very use case driven. So saying, look, what's the thing that we can use technology to do to make our business better, and then driving everything back from that. I think the big bang, the big bang approach is another sort of big risk. I think there's been a lot of hype, and it's frankly, I think it predates the current wave of technology. I sort of go back to, the ERP wave of the 1990s and 2000s, and I think there was a great hope that we're going to get everything onto one system, and that was going to solve a lot of problems. And outside of a few organizations, I don't think it has, and I think it's one of the things that's maybe engendered a little bit of that mistrust. And so I think now, sort of starting off with the broader organization, the business, if you like, have identified a challenge that we're going to work on together. Here's the metric we're going to try and improve. Let's go out and improve it together. And once we've done that in a couple of areas, then we start to see the common technology threads that have made that succeed. And then we can start focusing on the technology roadmap. In
almost every episode that we've had in this podcast, we always talk about this principle of earning your complexity. And I think you just described that, like innovation's no different. We get people who are saying, I just want machine learning in this project. And we're like, wait, time out for a second. Machine learning for what? Is there a way we can, what are you trying to do? What is it that requires this type of intelligence? So I think you're right, like starting from a good baseline and then thinking about what you need for, moving forward.
One of the big mistakes too I see on the big bang side of things is the whole microservices fad. Now I call it a fad because it's an architecture. It's going to be around a long time. It's a really good architecture for the right organizations, and a really bad architecture for other organizations. It's really contextual. And I see people saying, we're going to be a microservices company. And they start these big bang rewrites on million-line code bases. And they get halfway through and realize that this thing is the forever project. It's never going to get done because no one person at the entire company, or maybe anybody, knows everything that the product does and all the edge cases in it. And they always advise companies in that regard to bite off small chunks, or do what Capital One did, which is write this wrapper around the entire system and make it a proxy, and then rewrite it very piecemeal into the new system, and then break it out so that you have complete control over it and you don't end up bringing your entire system down. They've been very successful. A lot of talks out there. I recommend watching them if you're listening and have that problem. But I've seen so much money get thrown away from big bang rewrites that it's kind of disheartening, but also, heartening because it gives us opportunity to save some projects.
Yeah, it's one of those great examples where you have to start from what were you trying to achieve by moving to being microservices, and if you ask why a couple of times, you probably get down to, well, there's all this useful customer insight and information and business process and things that we can do if we could just access inside of this big monolithic application we've got. And so the answer is, right, how do you break out the first three of those things that you need to do the one most important business thing you want to do? And then you do that, and then you move to the next thing, and it will probably, and the interesting thing is when you probably look at those projects and you count them up in number of, person hours of development and total elapsed time, they probably take longer than sort of the plan with contingency of doing the big bang rewrite. But the difference is you'll get to the end of one of them because you're constantly giving people stuff they're excited about the whole way through, versus just giving them a lot of cost and fear and grief and doubt.
Yep. And then also you get to figure out if it's even possible. Some systems, not that they can't be rewritten, it would just be like inhuman amount of hours to get it done. And so it gives you an opportunity to do checkpoints and say, is this continue? Like, did we get the value out of it already, as you mentioned, or do we need to continue doing it? Most systems have 4 or 5 big components that change every day. And then they have 70 components that change maybe once a year. And just pulling 5 of those out might be enough to say, you know what, we're moving at a very fast clip with our development. We're able to satisfy our customers. We're getting the insights we need. What's the point of continuing? You already got your value out of it. Yeah, no one really wants to touch it, but then you can say, hey, before we touch that code in about a year, we'll go ahead and try to rewrite it a month ahead of time and focus on it when it's important, and really be able to maximize customer delivery value and speed.
Yeah, I think that's where you're seeing the advent of a lot of technology like, RPA and other sort of bots is, it may seem crazy that the right solution is to take another program and have it imitate a human working through the user interface of this legacy system. But at some point, it's easier to document what a person would do to deal with the problem than it is to go in and dig through a complex legacy code base.
So one common thread I've been listening to in our conversation is, when we talk about incremental innovation, build towards a vision, it really comes down to people. And, Ed, what I love about your discussion is you have a very practical and thoughtful approach to innovation. Like, where did you learn this? Did you take a class or something? Because it's not very common. So how do you foster more thoughtful innovation?
I think the short answer is you fail at it a few times.
Trial and error.
But I think that's true to a certain extent. Is that I'm lucky to have had the opportunity to start doing a few things sort of early in this cycle of digital innovation, and therefore been able to fail at them and therefore pattern recognize when it's not going to work. But I think the one of the biggest things that I've learned, and I think what I said in the previous comment flows into this as well, is fundamentally what you're doing with an innovation is a human problem, not a technical problem, right? You're trying to solve problems for customers. You're trying to solve problems for business people. You're trying to solve problems for people who are working in organizations day to day on the front line. And if you thinking about what their needs are, and sometimes those needs are different from the most efficient technical way to deliver a product or deliver a piece of innovation, then that sort of gets you there and gets you to move along. So I think that's from the thinking about things from the people perspective has always been a better approach for me than looking at it from what technologies could I use to solve this particular problem.
Yeah, I think you're right. Technology is a tool at the end of the day, but it's a tool used by people. Even AI will be a tool for a long time. We may invite true AI, and then I think we become the tool. But until that day, which is probably a long way off, we're going to be using computers as our tool, and to drive through technology is the wrong answer. There's a lot of great technology out there: document databases, RDBMS, AI systems, TensorFlow, Keras, right? There's tons and tons of tech out there, but being able to pick the right ones that are going to solve your problem with the least amount of cost to generate the most amount of value, it's an art form, it's a science. It really is, what we call thoughtful software on our side, but I'm sure you guys have monikers internally.
Thoughtful
Bain,
innovation.
Thoughtful innovation, right? It's it really is important that you keep on the mind of why you're doing something, and the why behind anything is probably the most important thing.
Yeah, a couple of the things I've seen, like from in an incentive perspective, like some of these innovation organizations or groups where, they'll be tasked with saying, okay, this year you have to come out with 40 different projects, innovative projects. And so they're just like, they're not even thinking about people. They're just thinking about hitting this marker, for budget reasons or for, bonuses or et cetera. So there's that in play right now. I mean, I've seen that happen. So, again, I think it's a very powerful point to say, it's all about people.
I think people think of disruptive innovation. They look at the iPhone. That's the most current. And then, if you go back a little bit, you get the airplane. There are a lot of disruptive innovations that seemingly are disruptive until you understand the underlying reasons they can be innovative and the reasons they can exist, and don't see that it's actually, maybe the iPhone was innovative in the way it put all the parts together that were possible. But, you have the ARM CPU, you have very small RAM, you have a very small compute board, the ability to manufacture aluminum in the way they did, and the form factor they did, to be able to manufacture the glass. All of that existed, and they managed to put it together. And that's really awesome. But and the way they did it was disruptive, right? Don't get me wrong. Just look at Apple stock, even though it's fourth most valuable. They're still they created hundreds of billions of dollars in shareholder value and internal value. And that way it was very disruptive, but people don't see that it's actually, even the car, right? Wasn't this just big bang invent 100 different things at one time. It was, everything was already invented. Someone put it together in an innovative way. Even proliferation of cars, the car didn't matter. What mattered was the assembly line that made the cars be able to proliferate. From Henry Ford, that was his most important innovation, because he didn't invent the car. So it's interesting to look at.
Yeah, I think I've heard somebody define innovation somewhere, and I cannot remember where this was, as basically it's the difference between invention and innovation is invention is creating something completely new out of whole cloth, and innovation is taking things from different contexts and putting them in a new one. I mean, you're exactly right on the iPhone. I mean, there are so many. That was such a combination of some new technology, some fantastic industrial design, to a certain extent figuring out the misses that they could get away with. I mean, there was no good software ecosystem yet when they first launched it, but the apps that were on it to start with were good enough. There was no GPS on it to start with. But nobody was used to walking around with the GPS in their pocket other than hikers at that point, and car navigation was still pretty early, so they had a couple of generations to get the chips miniaturized down and into the iPhone. The thing I'll always remember about that is I was about the time the iPhone came out, I was working on a project that was basically looking at another kind of smartphone. And what was fascinating about the other smartphone we were working on is it looked at things from a completely different perspective. It looked at things from this perspective of let's look at these emerging social networks. And at the time it was really Facebook and Twitter. And what if we put those front and center on the smartphone rather than the sort of app type approach? And what was fascinating there is that was too early. Right? There were, there was some other, that phone didn't work, and there were a bunch of other reasons why it didn't. But one of them was that, social media then was not the thing it is today. And, what you've seen more recently is the smartphone evolve so that basically, that those social media feeds are becoming more and more central on the phone. But there's a lot of it that's about timing. It's about the ecosystem being ready.
It's really interesting when you look at one of my favorite sections in stock market history is I think it's 2012 to 2014 when RIM stopped innovating and they basically paused, and all the late adopters of the iPhone were still on BlackBerry because you weren't going to rip BlackBerry out of their cold dead hands. Like no one was leaving their BlackBerries. That was a lot of users, and really. Apple has probably $200-300 million, $1 billion in market cap to thank for RIM choosing to do nothing about their phones. And then they tried to do a few things. They tried to adopt Android, that failed. Then they kind of just sold. I forget who they sold to. Irrelevant at this point. And it was so fascinating to me watching a company like RIM that for a long time they were, everyone loved their BlackBerry. And I owned one. I didn't like it as much as I liked my Android, and I switched to iPhone. But people that had their BlackBerries, they swore by them. Like people had 6-year-old, 7-year-old phones just to keep the BlackBerry. It was crazy. That's one of my favorite innovation stories. I always tell people about RIM. Just because it's a perfect example of a company that had a loyal customer base, they kept up, even kept up with the market, even like made an app store and did all that, and a security policy. They may have been able to stay alive, limp along for sure, but would have been able to still be a viable company.
Yes, interesting topic. As a final thought, just related to that, Ed, is what do you see coming up in the next few years or a few months that is disruptive or something that may challenge a company, or I don't know, anything that you find interesting in the next few months or years?
So I think that the outlook's a little different for a few months, few years. I think it's going to be interesting to see sort of the response to the economic cycle. I mean, I think we've been in, the longest period of economic growth since the Great Depression, sort of 2010 now to present. And I think we're probably about to plateau on that, if not, unfortunately, go in the other direction. And so it'll be interesting to see how a lot of current innovation, which is sort of geared towards consumer consumption, how that changes. Are there going to be, different? How is that going to drive companies to innovate differently? How is that going to drive business models to innovate differently? The longer term thing, and I think it's over the next few years, is going to be, we've sort of talked about cloud computing and the AWSs and Azures and Google Clouds of the world, basically moving us to a point where hardware provisioning is instantaneous. We talked a little bit about open source as well. And if I look at, I'm a big fan of React, for example, as a front-end framework. And you look at how much easier that has made web front-end development and sort of some of the impacts you're starting to see on mobile cross-platform developments. If you look at that a few years down the track, and I think there's similar things you're seeing on the back end from a software perspective, whether it's Firebase or some of the other sort of platforms or services out there. How easy is it going to be to write a web app and a mobile app? Like how much easier can that get? Not because the actual fundamental problems have got easier, but just because so much of the software is already there and written, and it becomes a configuration problem rather than a right programming or a coding problem. And so I'm fascinated to see how far that can get and what that allows developers and engineers to do when you free up a lot of that sort of basic UI and app development stuff. What else can you put your time to in terms of generating better experiences for customers?
On the same note as that, the thing I'm excited about is the proliferation of low-code data science tools in the cloud platforms. Azure, AWS has them now. Google has them. You see it in computer vision. You see it with other techniques. Some things can't be achieved by these platforms, but it's very encouraging that these very early tools and allow developers that would otherwise never be able to do data science and AI to do them. And it also frees up the actual data scientists and the machine learning experts to go on and focus on harder problems instead of these small trivial things like pulling text off of a receipt or something like that.
Thanks for listening. You can always connect with us at skiplist.com.